in this week's Bizline, Vietnam leads rapid recovery in Southeast Asian supply chains, according to Nikkei. And later on, opportunities to attract green investment in Vietnam. Hello there, you're tuning into Bizline, our weekly economic journal on VTV International. I'm Hoàng Hằng, and as usual, we now take a look at news making headlines in Vietnam's economic scene this week.
Vietnam is leading the rapid recovery in Southeast Asian supply chains, according to Nikkei Asian Review. Vietnam's number of coronavirus cases has gradually declined since peaking in late August. Since October, the utilization rate at factories has been steadily recovering. Companies that produce electrical and electronic components essential for the auto industry are also returning to full strength. Vietnam was the source of about 40% of Japan's wire harness import last year, one of the components that experienced a shortage in supply. Japanese suppliers restoring production in Vietnamese plants is expected to support a production comeback to Japan's auto sector.
October marked a milestone in the control of COVID-19 for Vietnam, and along with it, the shifting from a defensive stance to safely adapting to the disease. Thanks to efforts of the country and authorities at all levels, Vietnam has retained its image as an attractive destination for foreign investors. According to the Ministry of Planning and Investment, foreign investors poured $23.74 billion into Vietnam in the first 10 months of 2021, up 1.1% year-on-year. Strong growth was recorded in both newly registered capital and additional capital, up 11.6% and 24% respectively. The processing and manufacturing industry leads the total investment of over $12.7 billion, accounting for about 54% of total registered investment capital.
Vietnam locked a record trade surplus of $2.85 billion in October after localities eased social distancing measures. In the January-October period, the country recorded a trade surplus of $160 million. In October, domestic enterprises posed a faster recovery than FDI firms in terms of export. Leather and footwear, fishery, textile and wood industries have recovered strongly, with growth rates as high as 40% and record export turnovers. October's index of industrial production rose by nearly 7% from the previous month, while goods transportation grew by nearly 14%.
Positive signs of recovery have been seen in seafood production, processing and export in many localities since early October. According to the Vietnam Association of Seafood Exporters and Producers, fisheries exports reached $918 million in October, equal to the figure of the same period last year, and a rise of 47% over last month. An upturn was seen in the majority of products exported, such as tuna, squid, octopus, and shrimp. In the first 10 months of this year, fisheries exports were estimated at $7.1 billion, a slight rise of 2.4% compared to last year.
1 month after social distancing was lifted in Ho Chi Minh City, 96% of enterprises have resumed operations, according to the city's Export Processing and Industrial Zone Authority. More than 230,000 employees across these enterprises, or 80% of their workforce, have returned to work. In addition, 94% of the city's workforce has been fully vaccinated or has recovered from COVID-19. Many enterprises have been proactive in planning production in accordance with the new situation, with preventive measures in place. Previously, the city's high-tech park put a 2,000-bed concentrated quarantine site into operation to receive mild-infected workers and those who cannot quarantine at home.
Those are some highlights in Vietnam's economic scene. Up next in our crosstalk, we will take a look at Vietnam's effort to promote green projects and green financing in a bid to achieve sustainable development in the future. In his speech at the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference of the Parties, or COP26, Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh reaffirmed Vietnam's goal of sustainable development, in which financing must lend leverage to the transitioning of the development model toward a green, circular, sustainable, inclusive, and humanistic economy, with environmental, social, and governance, or ESG investing becoming a global trend. Vietnam has been fostering ESG practices in enterprises, green projects, and green financing, reflecting Vietnam's determination to achieve sustainable development. So how has this been done in the country? How can Vietnam grasp opportunities to attract investment flows in this regard? We'll find out in this week's Bizline. But first, let's learn what ESG is and how much potential green investing has around the globe in the following clip.
Environmental, social, and governance, or ESG criteria, are a set of standards for a company's operations that socially conscious investors use to screen potential investments. ESG investing has been growing in popularity around the world as investors have focused more on the sustainable development of companies they pour money into.
The truth is that there is a tsunami of money being directed at ESG investments. You cannot do too badly being in the basket of ESG assets just because there's going to be $1 trillion more coming into that asset class. If nothing else, that's going to take prices up.
ESG investing continues to grow. According to the latest report by Morningstar, the global sustainable universe attracted $185.3 billion in net inflows in the first quarter of 2021, up 17% from the previous quarter. As of the first quarter 2021, 4,523 sustainable funds were available in the market.
Shareholders, investors, and customers are going to be intolerant of purely profit-motivated businesses that don't care about their externalities or that engage in bad behavior. And this intolerance is manifesting itself in pure outperformance of ESG investments in terms of shareholder returns in both up and down markets. Even in a down market during COVID, the ESG bucket way outperformed.
According to Bloomberg Intelligence's latest ESG 2021 mid-year outlook report, ESG assets are on track to exceed $50 trillion by 2025, representing more than a third of the projected $140.5 trillion in total global assets under management.
In order to learn more about the topic, we connected with Mr. Tim Evans, Chief Executive Officer of HSBC Vietnam. Well, welcome to our Bizline program. It is forecast that ESG assets will exceed $50 trillion by 2025. How does this reflect the significance of ESG criteria in the development of enterprises in particular and sustainable development of countries in general, as well as foster investment flows?
The transition to net zero is something that is happening now. It needs to happen now. Right now I'm sat in the city of Ho Chi Minh, which all indications are that by 2030 could potentially be underwater. So we're talking 9 years away, 8 years away. So that just shows how incredibly important this transition to net zero is. And if you look at the number of natural disasters that have impacted the world over the last 50 years, it's up 5 times. And that is particularly true here in Vietnam, where last year we saw the terrible flooding in the central provinces. So this is something that is absolutely critical, not just for Vietnam, because climate change is not limited to countries, it's a global issue. And it's very reassuring that Prime Minister Chinh at COP26 said that addressing climate change and reforestation and looking after the environment is one of his top priorities. So absolutely, this is something that needs to be done by countries, it needs to be done by companies, it needs to be done by individuals. And the only way that we can get there is through providing the funding so that the companies can address this, can innovate, can come up with new processes to ensure that together we all protect the environment and the climate.
How has the pandemic affected ESG investing?
So the pandemic has impacted our lives in many, many ways. And when it first impacted, I remember watching YouTube videos or clips of how nature was regenerating itself because people were traveling less and there was less carbon dioxide being pumped into the air. And as a result of that, I think it acted as a catalyst for ESG. We have had to review how we live and how we choose to live going forward. And it has forced us to become much more sensitized to what's happening to the environment. And I think the big change is that creating ESG policies, driving an ESG agenda is no longer seen as an administrative burden, but actually not only the right thing to do, but also a source of competitive advantage. And this is being driven not just by governments, not just by companies, but also investors. Investors are requiring the companies that they invest in have a very clear sustainability framework so that they can play their part in addressing climate change. But it goes beyond that as well. Team members, employees are now demanding that they work for companies that are doing the right thing for the environment. So all these forces have come together out of COVID and is forcing the agenda. And it's now up to governments to not just mandate, but also incentivize companies, individuals, investors to adopt green and environmentally suitable practices.
In Vietnam, the Vietnam Sustainability Index, or VNSI, was launched in 2017. It is one of the key achievements of the financial sector, contributing to the National Green Growth Strategy. The VNSI is a cap-weighted, free-float adjusted index, which consists of listed companies with higher scores of sustainability. The constituents of VNSI are selected from the 100 largest companies listed on the Ho Chi Minh Stock Exchange. ESG disclosure information is a key input of the VNSI annual selection. The index is designed as a reference tool or an underlying for the development of future financial instruments, such as ETF and index derivatives. Its objectives are to recognize the best ESG practices implemented by publicly listed companies in Vietnam, promote the adoption of ESG standards, and create attractive investment products for investors.
Meanwhile, in Vietnam, the Vietnam Sustainability Index launched in 2017 has been a measure for ESG performance in the country. So what are your comments on this index and Vietnamese enterprises' performance in this regard?
I think it's a very strong indication of commitment to ESG activities that the stock exchange has a sustainability index, and a sustainability index that was created 4 years ago. So it hasn't come out of the current pandemic. This is something that Vietnam clearly acknowledged and was working on. And I think part of the reason for that is that if you look at the World Bank statistics, Vietnam is one of the 5 countries in the world which will be most adversely impacted by climate change. And the big companies in Vietnam will be a catalyst for this. They will help power Vietnam into the green world. It has been adapted by many of the large Vietnamese corporates, many of whom we bank, and the level of engagement that we're seeing from Vietnamese corporates around driving additional green activity is higher than we've seen in the past. And just this year alone, we helped Vinpearl put together the first sustainable exchangeable bond, not in Vietnam, but globally. And that is a clear indication of the corporate sector here embracing the green agenda, doing what is right, and financing itself in a way to continue to drive its green agenda.
A number of investment funds have had more interest in ESG investing. How can this become an opportunity for Vietnam to attract investment, in your opinion?
Look, I think when we come out of the current COVID crisis, the engine for economic growth will continue to be Asia. And then when you look within Asia, Vietnam is one of those countries that really will show very strong economic growth. We saw it last year that despite the challenges of COVID, Vietnam still had 2.9% GDP growth. And our view is that that will resume next year. So what does that mean? There's very clear opportunities for Vietnam going forward. It is both through FDI, but also through equity investment. And investors are now demanding more and more that the companies that they invest in and the countries that they invest in embrace the need to address climate change. And Vietnam is a country that is very, very susceptible to climate change. So Vietnam is well positioned economically. Vietnam needs to address its climate change issues. The Prime Minister was at COP26 and clearly articulated that Vietnam is prioritizing the need to address climate change. And so when investors put all of that together, a government that's keen to act on it, a corporate sector that's keen to act on it, a banking sector that's prepared to finance it, I think the opportunities for Vietnam are very, very positive.
A number of investment funds such as Tundra Sustainable Frontier and AFC Vietnam have applied ESG criteria to consider their investment portfolios in Vietnam. Experts believe that there is a huge opportunity for the country to attract green investment, especially post-pandemic.
The world is increasingly demanding for more green elements in products and services. This is the chance for Vietnam to increase its competitiveness over the long run, especially in terms of its exports to more developed economies where laws and regulations are more stringent on the product origin and the environmental footprint.
During the COP26, Standard Chartered Bank committed to pour $8.5 billion into Vietnam to foster sustainable projects in the country. Meanwhile, HD Bank and Affinity International Investment Fund also signed a cooperation agreement on supporting and mobilizing capital for HD Bank to support Vietnamese enterprises with $300 million financing programs that meet ESG and sustainable development criteria.
Khả năng của bên tài trợ và mong muốn của bên tài trợ thì nó cao rất nhiều. Tuy nhiên là cũng chưa thể tính toán được chính xác là có bao nhiêu quỹ, có khối lượng tiền tệ đang chờ để đẩy vào Việt Nam vào chương trình này là bao nhiêu. Hiện nay tôi sự đánh giá rằng nó lớn hơn cái khả năng hấp thụ của các doanh nghiệp Việt Nam.
According to experts, projects which meet ESG standards usually require large initial investment capital, while their product selling price is high and profit margin is not significant. This is also a challenge for enterprises to develop such projects, while the potential to attract investment is still good.
How do you assess Vietnam as a destination for ESG investing? How bright are the prospects in Vietnam in terms of green investing?
So Vietnam is the country in ASEAN that has the most renewable finance, which I think is a very positive outcome when you look at where Vietnam is positioned compared to the other ones. And Vietnam has the enviable opportunity around wind energy. It has a very large coastline, quite a shallow seabed, which means that wind energy becomes an economic and financially viable option. You have very significant solar coverage, and Vietnam has amongst the highest solar coverage within ASEAN. And finally, you have the opportunities around hydroelectric power. So Vietnam has all the natural resources to allow it to embrace these renewable energies and thereby adapt and ensure that climate change is arrested.
Several banks in Vietnam have facilitated green credit over recent years. So how big is the room for green credit here in Vietnam, in your opinion?
So right now, indications are that if you look at the banking sector, around 4% of total assets are green assets. Now, this is a very big improvement from where we've been, but there's clearly room to do a great deal more. And I think that where we need to aspire to is that within the next 5 to 10 years, around 30% of the assets that are provided, the loans that are provided by the banking sector, should be green. It's only that way that we will be able to collectively address climate change. There's a need for companies to adopt the green frameworks. There's a need for us as individuals to do it. There's a need for governments, but especially as banks, we provide finance, the lubricant for the economy. We need to be in a position where we can provide financing that supports these green initiatives, that supports the companies to become more innovative and to reduce their carbon footprint.
Outstanding loans for green projects of this bank have reached over $438 million, accounting for 8% of its total outstanding loans.
Lãi suất cho các cái khoản tín dụng xanh thường là thấp hơn từ 1 đến 2% so với các khoản tín dụng thông thường khác. Cái thứ hai nữa là tín dụng xanh ấy thì bao giờ cũng được ưu tiên. và gần như là không bao giờ có những hạn chế về việc tăng trưởng. Chúng tôi chỉ hạn chế tăng trưởng vào ngành nghề khác.
Meanwhile, some other banks have attracted foreign investment thanks to their focus on green credit.
Chúng tôi đã chủ động giải ngân vào cái khu vực này mà thật sự là cũng chưa cần phải chờ đến cái vốn đầu tư của khu vực nước ngoài, và thật sự hữu xạ tự nhiên hơn. Thì như vậy là chính là nhờ như vậy thì các nhà đầu tư ở nước ngoài tìm đến.
According to the State Bank of Vietnam, as of the first quarter of this year, 67 out of 84 credit institutions in Vietnam spurred green credit, with an amount accounting for 3.6% of the market's total outstanding loans.
What can be done to foster ESG practices as well as green investing in the country?
I think the key drivers to driving ESG in Vietnam and any country is A, we need to be talking about it. B, the government has to create policies and incentives to ensure that people embrace this. Companies need to take the step to becoming more green themselves. So HSBC, for example, all of our credit cards is recyclable plastic. Individuals also need to embrace this. But climate change is not for one person or one company to do, or one country to do. It is a global issue. Climate change doesn't know borders. And so to drive this agenda, we all have to embrace it. Bankers, companies, governments, individuals.
Most firms implementing ESG practices have a large scale. So how can the ESG be promoted in small and medium-sized enterprises to help them gain long-term benefits rather than profits alone?
So delivering net zero for SME companies, HSBC's analysis and research shows that it'll cost $50 trillion. That is a very, very large sum of money for companies that don't always have the ability to raise that level. And the way that we will be able to support the SME sector is for companies within the supply chain not to mandate to SME companies, you must become green, but to support them, to help them, to provide liquidity through supply chain financing. But it's something that will be done together. The SMEs do not have the balance sheet strength to do it on their own. And therefore, the way that the SME sector will become green is through incentivization programs, is through collaboration with larger companies, and is ultimately also through support from banks. So HSBC has recently entered into a joint venture with Temasek in Singapore, where we will look to fund projects which would not quite be fundable at bank level because they're considered maybe a little bit too risky. But by partnering with Temasek, we will look to fund green infrastructure projects that would otherwise not get the funding that they need. And these are the steps that we all have to take to ensure that we have a safer, better, cleaner environment in which to live with in the future.
Well, once again, thank you so much, Mr. Tim Evans, for joining our Bizline program. Vietnam has gradually improved its position in terms of sustainable development in the world. Along with support policies to attract investment in green projects, this has made the country more attractive to foreign investors. The International Finance Corporation, or IFC, a member of the World Bank Group, said that implementing the national target of reducing total greenhouse gas emission by 9% by 2030 to mitigate the effects of climate change will provide a climate investment opportunity worth $753 billion for Vietnam in the 2016 to 2030 period. This will contribute to realizing the country's goal of sustainable development in the coming time. And that brings us to the end of our Bizline program. To rewatch our program, please log on to our official website at vtv4.vtv.vn or simply download our app from our App Store and Google Play for a lot more. Goodbye for now, and thanks for tuning in.